The last thing Eva Voss did before she filed the paperwork was water her snowdrops. 3 of them. White bells. Thin as paper. Drooping from stems she'd kept alive in a cracked ceramic pot on her windowsill for 11 months. The window itself was sealed against the rain, not the ordinary rain which had stopped years ago, but the new rain, the gray chemical slurry that stripped paint off metal and left pink welts on exposed skin. She'd taped the seal herself. One long strip of insulation foam she'd bought with 2 weeks of energy rations. Beyond the glass, the Concordat city stretched flat and brown under clouds the color of a dead screen. She watered the flowers with 6 milliliters of filtered water. She counted. Then she put on her coat, took the transit pod to Administration Building 7, and submitted Form D7. Voluntary cessation request, citing chronic resource deficit and absence of forward utility. Clerk. A man with a narrow face and kind eyes who probably filed 60 of these a week, scanned her ID chip, stamped the form, and told her the appointment would be assigned within 30 days. She thanked him. She meant it. On the way home, she stopped at the garden, where she worked. The garden was not a garden. It was a climate-controlled facility 3 city blocks wide, housing 11,000 individual Galanthus specimens behind layered polyfilm and electromagnetic shielding. Engineers called them the Galanthus Array. Everyone else called them the flowers. The flowers were the only reason the city's grid ran. The flowers were the only reason any grid anywhere ran. Now that the Keth had salted the fusion infrastructure from orbit 16 years ago and moved on to whatever came next on their list of things to ruin, nobody knew exactly why the Keth had done it. The leading theory was that they hadn't needed a reason. The second theory was that it was a demonstration. Look how easily a civilization switches off. The third theory, held by a small and increasingly frustrated group of physicists, was that the Keth had simply been testing something and hadn't cared enough to ask permission first. All 3 theories led to the same place. 3 billion humans on a dying electrical grid, and 11,000 snowdrops in a sealed building on the edge of a ruined city, putting out a trickle of biophotonic energy that nobody fully understood and nobody had been able to replicate. Eva had worked in the garden for 9 years. She knew every plant by its pot number, knew which ones were temperamental about humidity, which ones had survived the second containment breach in year 4, which ones seemed, and she'd never said this to anyone, to like her. She was not sentimental by nature. She simply paid attention. She was paying attention now, doing her last walkthrough before the appointment came through, when she found the anomaly. 7-Sev-41, one of her 3 oldest specimens. She'd almost lost it in year 4 and had stayed an extra shift every day for a week, playing recordings of her mother's old folk songs through a small speaker next to the root bed because she'd read somewhere, in a book, an actual paper book from before, that plants responded to acoustic vibration. It had recovered. She'd kept the speaker. She still played music to 7741, quietly, at the end of the shift. Old melodies, the kind with no words, the kind her mother had hummed while hanging laundry in a courtyard that no longer existed. The anomaly was light, not the pale blue-white of standard biophotonic emission. This was warm, gold-white, faint as a whisper, pulsing in a rhythm she couldn't immediately identify. She crouched. Looked. The petals of 7741 were trembling in the still air of the facility, emitting light from their interior structure or, in a way she had never seen, and the instruments weren't flagging, because the instruments were calibrated for the known emission spectrum, and this was not the known spectrum. Eva sat on the floor of the garden at 11:30 at night, with her back against a workbench, and watched 7741 glow. 20 minutes. She got out her personal recorder and began documenting. She did not file anything, not yet. She sat with the information the way she sat with most things, quietly, at a remove, letting it settle into its true shape. She went home. She watered the flowers on her windowsill. She slept 6 hours, which was 4 more than usual. In the morning she went back. The emission had not stopped. It had, in fact, intensified slightly. She checked the readouts. Standard biophotonic output from 7741 was running at approximately baseline. The secondary emission, the warm light, the gold-white pulse, was occurring in addition to and not in replacement of the standard output. Plant was producing 2 distinct and simultaneous energy signatures, and the instruments were only seeing one of them because they were only built to look for one. She spent the next 4 days not sleeping much, and not eating much, and not thinking about Form D7. She ran every diagnostic she had access to. She pulled the acoustic logs and found that the emission rhythm matched, almost exactly, the melodic pattern of the last song she'd played to 7741 before her final shift. An old tune her mother had loved, 3 beats and a rest. 3 beats and a rest. The plant was pulsing in time with a song. She ran the correlation twice, because she didn't believe it the first time, and the second time she sat very still for a long while, and thought about what it meant, that something she'd done out of grief and habit, and mild scientific curiosity, had accidentally caused a breakthrough nobody had achieved in 16 years of trying. She brought in Miro. Was the facility's senior biophysicist, and also, incidentally, the only person at the garden who still brought her coffee without being asked. He was a large, slow-moving man who thought carefully before speaking and had been described by his thesis advisor 20 years ago as stubbornly honest. He looked at 7741 for a long time. He looked at Eva's documentation. He sat down on the same spot on the floor where she'd sat, in approximately the same position, and looked at the plant some more. How long, he said. 6 days now. And the others? She hesitated. I haven't checked the ones at home. They went to her apartment. They brought equipment. The 3 snowdrops on her windowsill. The ones she'd had for 11 months. The ones she'd watered with 6 milliliters. The ones she'd spoken to in the mornings without quite meaning to, were all producing the secondary emission. All 3. Different rhythms, slightly different spectra, as if they were 3 instruments playing variations on the same theme. The output from each was small. Together, the 3 plants in a cracked ceramic pot on a sealed windowsill in a gray city were generating enough secondary biophotonic energy to power a standard residential lighting array for 8 hours. Miro said something she didn't catch. Sorry, I said, he repeated, that this is the thing. This is the actual thing. Whatever the Keth broke, this is what fixes it. He looked at her. You understand that? She didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the plants, trembling slightly. The way they always did. The way she'd thought was just a physical tick of the species. Now she understood they were resonating. They were responding to something in the acoustic environment of her apartment. To her voice, maybe, or the particular frequency of her footsteps on the floorboards, or the old recordings she played some nights, because the silence got heavy. They had been doing it all along. She just hadn't had the instruments to see it. Why didn't the garden specimens do this? Miro asked, though she suspected he was asking himself. They're behind the electromagnetic shielding, Eva said. Full spectrum suppression. We put it in after year 2 to protect the output consistency. She paused. We've been blocking it. 9 years we've been blocking the secondary emission because we didn't know it was there, and we built the shielding to exclude anything outside the standard range. The silence in her apartment was very specific, the kind that comes after a sentence that can't be unsaid. Outside, the gray rain ticked against the sealed window. One of the snowdrops pulsed warm and gold. Miro said, We have to take this to the Infrastructure Council. I know. And the Keth monitoring stations will flag any significant increase in grid output. If we scale this up, I know, Eva. She looked at him. Did you S7? She'd forgotten that she'd told him. She'd mentioned it the same way she mentioned most things. Matter-of-factly, in passing, because she didn't see a reason to make it larger than it was. She looked at the snowdrops. The 3 bells, white and trembling, the warm light moving in them like something breathing. Forward utility, she said. That's what the form asks. Whether you can identify a forward utility for your continued presence. She was quiet for a moment. Couldn't at the time. Miro nodded slowly. He didn't push it. That was something she'd always appreciated about him. Can you now? He asked. She didn't answer right away. She reached out and adjusted the position of the pot. A small correction, moving it 2 centimeters toward the light. The plants leaned, almost imperceptibly, in the same direction. I need to withdraw the form, she said. There's a process. I'll drive you. You don't have a car. I'll get one. The Infrastructure Council meeting was not what she expected, which was to say it was much worse, and then suddenly, sharply better. The first 2 hours were bureaucratic resistance, cost of refit, Keth monitoring risk, question of whether the secondary emission was stable, question of whether it could be replicated, question of whether Eva Voss, garden technician, was the appropriate person to be presenting this to the full council in the first place. She sat through it. She'd sat through longer. She answered every question in the same flat, careful tone she used for everything, without defensiveness and without apology. And when the senior counselor asked why this had taken 9 years to discover, she said simply that they had been looking for the wrong thing, which was not a criticism, just a fact. The third hour was different. The third hour was when Miro connected 7741 to the council chamber's isolated test grid, and the lights went on. The standard pale blue-white of the facility lights, warm, gold-edged. The kind of light that made people look at each other and remember something, though they couldn't have said what. The room was very quiet. Then someone started talking, and then everyone started talking. And Eva sat back in her chair and let it happen, because that was the moment she could stop holding it and let other people carry it for a while. The refit took 7 months. The decision had been made. Quickly, once made, the way decisions move when the alternative is darkness. To remove the full spectrum of electromagnetic shielding from 3 garden quadrants and replace it with selective shielding that preserved the standard biophotonic output while allowing the secondary emission to pass. The Keth monitoring concern was real and taken seriously. They brought in 2 communications engineers who specialized in signal masking and spent 6 weeks on a solution. The solution was elegant in the way the best solutions are, which is to say it looked simple and had taken enormous effort. Scale was the other problem. 11,000 plants, even producing double output, was not a civilization. It was a start. The Agricultural Directorate, which had been growing Galanthus specimens in standard light conditions for 4 years without understanding why none of them achieved full resonance, received a new directive. Acoustic exposure protocols, beginning at germination, varied frequencies, documentation of response patterns. It was slow work. It was the only work. Eva went back to her post. She did her rounds. She played music. She had withdrawn Form D7 on a Tuesday morning, 9 minutes before Miro arrived with a borrowed vehicle that turned out to be his neighbor's cargo cart. The clerk with the kind eyes had processed the withdrawal without comment, though he had looked at her for a moment in a way that might have been relief. She didn't know. She hadn't asked. She thought about that, sometimes. The narrowness of it, the 9-month space between the filing and the snowdrops on the windowsill. The way the smallest things accumulated into something you couldn't see until you were already inside it. She wasn't given to epiphany. She didn't reconstruct it as a lesson. It was just a fact about the way cause and effect moved through the world, often slowly, often below the threshold of any instrument you thought to build. The Keth had salted the old infrastructure because they'd wanted to see humanity's lights go out, or because they were testing something, or because they hadn't needed a reason. What they hadn't modeled, what the analysis teams now believed they hadn't modeled, based on the monitoring signals that had gone quiet, rather than alert, after the refit, which suggested the Keth were observing, but not acting, was this: that humans would spend 16 years in the dark and come out having learned to listen to flowers. Not metaphorically, literally. 11 months of a woman playing her dead mother's songs to a plant in a cracked ceramic pot on a windowsill in a sealed apartment in a ruined city. Because she paid attention to things, because she had always paid attention to things, because that was what she did. The warm light spread slowly outward from the garden. It spread the way all real things spread. Not in a wave, not in a proclamation, but grid by grid, district by district, in the particular gold-white of secondary biophotonic emission, which people describe differently depending on who they were. Like late afternoon, some said, or like a lamp in a window you recognize from a long way off, or like the light in a place where someone is still home. Eva did her last walkthrough of the night. She checked 7741. The bells trembled. Light moved in them. 3 beats in a rest. 3 beats in a rest. The melody her mother had hummed in a courtyard a long time ago. She turned off her recorder. She went home. She watered the snowdrops on her windowsill with 6 milliliters of filtered water. She counted. She put on the music.